Kentaro Miura's Berserk is set in a gorgeous medieval European world that mixes many different folk and mythical inspirations for its building and lore. But one of its most intriguing cultural additions comes not from the West, but from the East. While most of the story is centered in and around the British-inspired kingdom of Midland, the second half sees that kingdom get invaded by an empire from the East with a history that might just rival its own. The Kushan Empire is one of the most feared powers in the world, and that's made evident by their dominance. But the real-world kingdom that inspired it was a center of religious freedom, cultural advancement, and the progress of civilization itself. In this video, we'll take a look at all the ways in which the Kushan Empire of Berserk is influenced by the one that ruled over ancient northern India. This is the Kushan Empire of Berserk Explained. They've always been Eastern enigmas. The introduction of the Kushan Empire in Berserk. The Kushan in the Berserk verse are introduced as an enigmatic people with an inclination for unique fighting styles and intense bloodshed. The first Kushan we ever meet is Salat, who is the young master or prince of the Bakiraka clan, an ethnic group that specializes in assassination. We then get to meet a few other members of his clan who had been hired by the King of Midland as his special hit squad, which he sets upon Griffith when he learns that the Falcons had escaped. Guts and the rest of the Griffith rescue team make a mockery out of these 5 highly skilled assassins, and for a while, that was all she'd written for the Kushan Empire, till they made their comeback during the Conviction arc. In the years following the eclipse, the Kingdom of Midland entered a period of rapid decline thanks to its king's madness. After the whole Griffith fiasco and him trying, and thankfully failing, at making a move on his daughter, the king's mind sort of broke. He ordered Griffith tortured for an entire year, and when the Falcon escaped, he sent 2 waves of hunters after him, the aforementioned Bakiraka and his Black Dog Knights. When they failed him as well, he dedicated nearly 3/4 of his kingdom's fighting forces to hunting down Griffith, which left Midland wide open for an invasion. This is something that was taken advantage of not by their old enemies from the west, but by a new enemy from the east. In chapter 133, we saw a bunch of men dressed in turbans and masks quite similar to Salat's entering Midland territory in droves. These scouts trampled everything they came across because their objectives were simple: clear the path ahead for the Kushan main army and hunt the Falcon of Oracle. That second half will make more sense later on in the video, but for now, let's focus on the former. These Kushan scouts were being led into battle in chapters 133 and 34 by none other than Salat himself, so you might be thinking that he was the catalyst of this invasion. The truth is, he was but a mere pawn, a precious one at that, but a pawn nonetheless. His clan had been enlisted by the Kushan royal family as the scouting and oracle hunting unit of the Midland invasion because, to put it quite simply, the Bakiraka wanted to return home. This is where we start learning the true history of the Kushan Empire, and it's fascinating, to say the least. Blood, betrayals, and brutal world domination. The history of the Kushan Empire in Berserk. For starters, Kushan isn't just the name of the territory, it's also the general name given to the ethnic groups that come from that particular territory. Kushan lands are no different from the kingdoms of the West in that each house wants to have what the next one has, and politicking is near constant. But there are 2 major houses in Kushan territories, the second one being the house Salat was serving during the invasion. Centuries ago, before the current royal house took power, the Bakiraka clan served as bodyguards and warriors for the previous royal family. But then, Emperor Ganishka's ancestors took control of the territories and expelled them from their homeland, treating them worse than scum because of the clan's origins as slaves. This is the reason the clan was forced to create a new home in a western mountain range and resort to assassination as a way of life. Over time, the Bakiraka gained considerable influence in the western hemisphere by acting as elite assassins for elite nobles. Yet, their hearts yearned for home, even after all those years, and that's why Salat decided to gamble his people's fate by siding with the Dread Emperor. When Ganishka came to power, things changed in the Kushan Empire because he was unlike any of his ancestors. Where his predecessors were too preoccupied with maintaining control over their squabbling territories, Ganishka made world conquest his life's ambition. He started clearing his court of any possible opposition, family and otherwise, at the ripe old age of 6. By the time he was 18, he had no political rivals left. Ganishka had taken out potential heirs in his childhood. To celebrate becoming an adult, he killed his father and unified disgruntled nobles with the promise of unending glory through a global conquest. The Kushan Empire had remained restricted to the east for centuries, but under Ganishka, it exploded onto the world stage. He unleashed his unstoppable war machine from the east like a scorching sun and trampled the competition wherever he went. The Dread Emperor was named so because fear is what kept his massive empire in line. Ganishka was known for employing brutal tactics like taking war slaves, throwing incapable prisoners into tar pits, forcibly marrying enemy princesses, and impregnating them to ensure his bloodline was attached to theirs, and countless other atrocities. But the same fear is what motivated him to kill his siblings and parent. It infected his son, and the cycle was perpetuated when the boy tried to kill his father, fearing the tyrant that Ganishka was. At some point during his outrageously ambitious campaign, the emperor returned home to attend a feast, only to be poisoned by his own son. When that failed, the Kushan prince turned the palace's guard spears against his father. But in his dying moments, Ganishka found the missing ingredient he needed to make his conquest of the world and his own fears undeniable. The eastern half of Berserk's world is shrouded in mystery, but what we do know is that it is a source of mystical happenings. In the first arc of Berserk, we were told that the Slug Count received his behelit from a traveling merchant that came from an eastern bazaar. This isn't followed up on, but the loose thread is intended to make you recall that detail when you see how Ganishka fast-tracks his world war. When humans are too slow, demons are the way to go. Ganishka's conquest and the fall of the Kushan. The Kushan war machine was formidable, but also slow. Conventional war tactics take time to bear fruit, and the numbers don't matter when you attack enemies in fortified locations because sieges are always going to take time. If he wanted to put the world under his thumb within his lifetime, the emperor needed to strike hard and strike fast without giving his enemies a chance to recover. And that's when a detail from his deep past comes into play. In his youth, Ganishka met a sage named Daiba, who handed him a behelit. This behelit was what Ganishka reached out to as he approached death's door, and it ended up transforming him into an apostle. The Kushan emperor ended his family's curse of intergenerational trauma by sacrificing his son to achieve his new existence. Once he gained the power of the abyss and a deeper understanding of the astral world, war became dramatically easier for him, to the point he created an entire secret division that he kept hidden from his main army for years. Once he became an apostle, Ganishka hunted down Daiba and made him his wizard general, because his plan for absolute world domination was now going to include magic. He created two demonic squads, the Pishachagana, or Enchanted Beasts unit, and the Dakagana, or the Demon Soldiers unit. By deploying these two units under the cover of his own fog, Ganishka was able to quickly decimate his opponents by catching them off guard. And this allowed his forces to make easy work of Midland. Shortly after the King of Midland's death, Ganishka's forces occupied the capital city, Wyndham, and took Princess Charlotte hostage. They then proceeded to steamroll through the rest of Midland's territories, because apart from those demon units we mentioned a moment ago, Ganishka also brought hundreds of thousands of soldiers with him. His assault on Vritannis alone was comprised of nearly 200,000 soldiers, and considering that was the entire Kushan main army, we can put the number of men he started this campaign with somewhere between 250,000 to 300,000, accounting for casualties and such. That attack on Vritannis can be thought of as a reclamation project more than an invasive attack, because the city used to be Kushan territory at one point in time. This is evidenced by the existence of the colonnade chamber in the Vandimian estate, and the existence of Kushan slaves in the city of Vritannis. Turns out, when the Holy See took over, they decided to give the Kushan a taste of their own medicine. But the fact that Ganishka reached Vritannis by land is a signifier of just how close he got to fulfilling his ambition. Vritannis lies upon the western edge of the world. It's the last major port in the west, and if you keep traveling in that direction, you'll come upon the mythical Skellig Island, and eventually the homeland of the Kushan. A full naval assault would have probably resulted in a reverse Pearl Harbor for the Kushan, considering the distance between their home and Vritannis, but Ganishka had an answer for that as well. He created his Demon Corps because he wanted them to carry out missions that he couldn't expect normal humans to accept without question. The result was that he was able to take over the entire shoreline of Vritannis in a single night. At the height of his power, Ganishka nearly unified the world under the eye that adorned his banners, and then he ran into Griffith. Over the course of his occupation of Midland, the Dread Emperor's hold was being steadily chipped away by the forces of the Falcon of Light. Griffith's reborn Band of the Falcon liberated many cities and towns that the Kushan had occupied. He took Ganishka's most important political prisoner from him when he rescued Princess Charlotte after distracting the Demon King. He sent in troops to thwart Ganishka's attempt to take over Vritannis overnight, and when the Emperor pulled up with his 200,000 men, Griffith summoned the wind itself to back him up in negotiations. The God Hand and the Apostle came to an understanding. They would fight their final battle in Windham a few days after, and may the best man win. But that moment marked the end of the Kushan Empire as the world knew it. During the final battle, Ganishka transformed himself into a Lovecraftian monstrosity that trampled over its own army. Those poor soldiers didn't get any rest in death either, because they were turned into pseudo-apostles to back up Ganishka in his fight with Femto. Some of his Kushan had already turned coat and joined up with Griffith, but if there were any doubters left, they now fully believed hitching their wagon to the Falcon was the best way to survive. And that belief paid off, because Femto did manage to slay the Eldritch Beast, but in the process, he changed the world. In this new world, the Kushan aren't a superpower like they were under Ganishka's reign. They've effectively been split down the middle, with those who came to Midland going over to Griffith's side following the Great Roar if they hadn't already, and those who stayed home remaining loyal to their Kushan roots. A third group, in the form of the Bakiraka clan, remained active in their home in the hills, determined not to take a side until they were sure their choice was the right one. Salat had already broken his promise to get his people back home once when he failed to deliver Griffith to Ganishka. The Dread Emperor was hunting the Falcon because he was aware of the gamble he was taking, standing up to a god hand as an apostle, and he was warned by his oracle that taking Griffith out of the equation was going to be crucial. Moreover, the Bakiraka prince started questioning his loyalties when he realized that his employer was an actual monster. Shortly before the Great Roar of the astral world, Salat encounters a Kushan turncloak named Jarif, who tries to convince the man to join the Falcon's side. But the young master remains unperturbed. He's determined to see with his own eyes what this new world that the Tempest of Causality is creating will look like, and only then will he make his decision. Clearly, him snooping around Griffith's castle and kidnapping the only guy that knows his secret besides Guts tells you that he didn't like what he was seeing. Now, we thought that with Ganishka's death, the Kushan would become an afterthought, and the Salat storyline would pick back up in the Bakiraka hideout. But Studio Gaga and Kujimori decided to shock us all by revealing that the young master did see through his clan's multi-generational dream of returning home, because in chapter 375, it's revealed that Guts' party had wandered off from Elfhelm towards Kushan lands. After coming to a mutual understanding that they needed to take out Griffith as soon as possible, the oddball trio of Daiba, Rickert, and Salat, which formed in the streets of Falconia, decided it wasn't safe to stay in the city any longer. Good call, considering they had an apostle on their tail, but just escaping wasn't going to be enough. If they wanted to stand a chance against a God Hand member, they needed to do something more than that. Perhaps that's why Salat decided to return home with a former ally and a former enemy. Chapter 375 makes it seem like the Bakiraka prince is the man currently in charge of Kushan affairs, and Daiba is serving as his chief advisor / sorcerer. Rickert has enlisted in the army to do whatever he can, and according to the events of that chapter, that is him saving his friends' lives. If Rickert hadn't come across Guts when Salat's men boarded the Seahorse, there's no telling how things might have unfolded. But now that all the good guys are in one place and headed towards the same destination, we feel comfortable saying that the Kushan Empire is going to be even more relevant and important than it was before. This is because it's the only place in the world that is fully aware of Femto's deception and true nature. It also explains why the God Hand wants to head east in chapter 372 and why this mini-arc is called the Eastern Exile chapter. So that's the blood-soaked, disturbing, riddled with injustice story of the Kushan Empire from Berserk. For a long time, they weren't taken seriously by the world at large because of their internal struggles. Today, they're the only resistance force strong enough to withstand Griffith's soldiers. But the Kushan hit their peak as a world power when Ganishka galvanized them into a united front. That is when they became the deadliest empire in the world. This reputation is pretty ironic considering the real-life civilization that Miura's Kushans were inspired by were anything but killers and savages. How are the two Kushan empires different from each other, and how are they similar? Cultures, weapons, and gods. The Kushan Empire we see in Berserk is very different from the Kushan Empire that existed in real life because, for starters, the real-world Kushan Empire wasn't a naval power. Like in Berserk, the term Kushan was originally associated with a tribe of people rather than a territory. Descended from the nomadic Yuezhi people who originated in northwestern China, the Kushan eventually found their way into Central Asia, where they settled in the region formerly known as Bactria, a mystical land that has been described as one of the 16 perfect places for the Iranian people to live in, according to Zoroastrianism. Bactria rose to prominence as part of the Achaemenid Empire and retained its relevance well after the fall of that empire. It cycled through the hands of several Greek rulers like Alexander the Great and Seleucus after him, and Bactria became a melting pot of Eastern and Western culture. Eventually, the region was taken over by the Yavana Raja, an Indo-Greek dynasty which was brought down from within by the Kushan. Kujula Kadphishes, often credited as the first Kushan king, unified the Kushan tribes under his rule and slowly but surely expanded his newly minted kingdom's borders beyond Bactria, chipping away at Persian, Chinese, and Indian territory. Once they took over, they ushered in a golden age for the region, which is sometimes referred to as Pax Kushana, in reference to the golden age of the Roman Republic following the fall of Caesar. Kushan rule was relatively brief, all things considered, for the empire was only active for about 2 centuries. But in that time, they managed to establish one of the most important syncretic world powers in history. The Kushan Empire's borders extended from modern-day Uzbekistan all the way up to the city of Pataliputra in India. They fought the Indo-Greek kingdoms, the Iranian empires, the Chinese Chinese Han dynasty, and the Kshatriyas of northern and northwestern India, annexing some or all of their territories at the height of their power. Their culture was a mix of Zoroastrianism, Hellenism, Hinduism, and Buddhism. This is best reflected in their coinage, which shows Greek inspirations in the earliest days of the empire and then moves to a more mixed expression of Kushan syncretism. Emperor Kanishka is remembered as one of the most important advocates of the Buddhist faith, for it was under his reign that Buddhism began spreading to China. He also arranged one of the biggest Buddhist councils, called Sangams, in which scholars and monks from the world over debate and update their understandings of their faith. The Kushans were heavily involved in opening up the Silk Road to the west, and their short 200-year reign brought a rare semblance of stability to an otherwise unstable region. Towards the end of their lifetime, the Kushans split into two halves, both of which were eventually subsumed by forces much larger than theirs. Western Kushan was conquered by the Sasanians, and Eastern Kushan eventually fell under Gupta rule. The history of Berserk's Kushan Empire is considerably longer, as we established in the previous section, and it's also far worse, as you might have figured out by now. But those aren't the only differences, and there are a few similarities between the two. Let's talk about the latter first. Like the real-life Kushan Empire, Berserk's Kushan Empire is also a syncretic polity in that it incorporates influences from multiple Indian cultures. But these influences are distinctly Middle Eastern and Indian, and include no traces of the Zoroastrian or Greek influences that can be predominantly seen in the real-life Kushan Empire. Let's start with their weaponry. When Salat is first seen in the series, he wields a pair of daggers called the Katars. We see him use razor-sharp disc-like projectiles called chakram, and a unique 5-bladed sword called the Urami, which might as well be a metal whip with blades once you see how it works. These weapons are of mixed Indian origins. The Katar and Urami were predominantly used by the southern kingdoms of India, while the chakram is a distinctly Sikh weapon. Also, North Indian kingdoms were not great naval powers, but South Indian kingdoms were, and the Kushan galleys look a lot like Chola warships. Miura-sensei likely misunderstood how a Bog Nok is wielded because his Bakiraka assassin looks like he has Wolverine's claws in place of the traditional palm-fitting claw dagger. And he also introduced gunpowder to a culture that wasn't traditionally known for using such weapons, but this is where the syncretic nature of Berserk's Kushan Empire intensifies. When you look at the actual main army of the Kushans and how it operates, you can see the Islamic influence, which likely came from the Mughals. The designs of the generals' armors are very reminiscent of Mughal livery, and the Kushan use a combination of elephants and cavalry in their army, which is something the Mughals did after conquering most of India. Their use of war slaves is also inspired by the treatment prisoners of war received under many kingdoms at the time, and their horde-like approach to war is heavily influenced by Genghis Khan's steamrolling of the world. The Bakiraka clan are Miura's interpretation of the Hashashins based out of ancient Syria, but their treatment will remind you of Bedouins, so you can see the many sources of inspiration he pulled from for his series. But the core element of Miura's Kushan Empire is decidedly Indian in nature, and that reveals itself in their symbolism and sorcery. The language of the Kushan is Hindi, modern Hindi to be precise. The one proper line of dialogue we get in the Kushan language in the series roughly translates to "tie up the horses over there," and it is written in the script and speech pattern that is predominantly spoken in India today. While there might be many other inspirations for the cultural aspects of the Kushan Empire, their language and religious doctrines are decidedly Indian. In the real world, Kushan emperors were believers of polytheism, but they practiced and propagated multiple religious beliefs at the same time. The emperor, Kajula, was said to be a devout Shaivite, which refers to a sect of Hinduism that views Shiva as the ultimate deity of their religious pantheon. When the sorcerer Daiba fights Serpico in Guts, he calls the former a Kshatriya of Vayu and the latter a Kshatriya of Durga. Kshatriyas are the warrior and ruler caste in Hinduism, and Guts and Serpico's skills alone earn them that distinction. But the Vayu and Durga suffixes are the real focal points here for us, because Vayu is the god of the wind and Durga is the patroness of war in Indian religion. This perfectly aligns with the attributes of both men's magical fetishes, because the sylph cloak and sword utilize wind elementals, and the berserker armor is a weapon bred for war. Ganishka himself becomes a version of Shiva later on in the series, and most of the spells we see Kushan sorcerers use are text bubbled in Sanskrit. So it's pretty clear that at least on the front of embracing Hinduism, the real and fictional Kushan empires did so with open arms. But this is also where the biggest difference between the two is revealed, because the former died out after getting divided in two, and the latter was murdered at the peak of its power. Also, it was ruled over by a tyrant, and that isn't what Kanishka the Great is remembered as. Emperor Ganishka versus Kanishka the Great, how Miura made the Kushan demonic. Kanishka the Great is a ruler that's remembered for spreading unity and faith. Under his rule, the Kushan Empire reached the zenith of its power, but he wasn't as into creating demonic soldiers as his fictional counterpart, and he certainly wasn't subjugating people to violence and enslavement like Emperor Ganishka. Where Kanishka's empire was a melting pot of different cultures and religions, and he embraced and promoted them all, Buddhism in particular, Ganishka was only interested in the dark magic applications of Hindu mysticism. He ordered his generals to create animal soldiers based on the concept of spirit possession and called them Pishacha, which is a pretty spot-on interpretation of those entities. In Hinduism, Pishacha is the name given to malign spirits that are liable to possess living spirits, making them evil, which is exactly what Ganishka's sorcerers do to crocodiles, tigers, elephants, and whales throughout the series. We don't know where Miura got the word Daka to describe the demon soldiers he created with the man-made Behelit, but you can see how that too could be inspired by the same mystic concept. And he also twists existing deities and their associated iconography to convey the unnatural and evil nature of his Kushan Empire. Miura calls Daiba's pterodactyl-looking aerial mounts Garudas. Garuda is the name of the divine creature that serves as the vehicle or vahana of the god Vishnu. Vishnu is one of the three primordial gods of Hinduism, and he is known as the Preserver because it's his role to preserve creation. Turning his mount into demonic dinosaurs is Miura's way of showing how any power, when used with ill intent, can be polluted. Another example of something like this comes from his interpretation of the figure of Durga. In chapter 231, we get a good look at Ganishka sitting on his throne in Windham, and turns out his throne is at the foot of a giant Durga statue. You can tell it's Durga because she has 10 arms, but then you look at the fangs coming out of her mouth and you think of Kali, the goddess of death. Now, that's fine because they're both aspects of the divine feminine in Hindu tradition, but you can understand what we mean when we say Miura twisted existing deities to fit his interpretation of the Kushans. And this is most clearly reflected in his portrayal of Ganishka. Emperor Ganishka has a reputation that is inversely proportional to that of Kanishka the Great. Name any devious soul-tainting trick in the Book of the Devil and he pulled it off 10 years ago. He conquered most of the world not to spread the good word of Buddhism, but to put it under his thumb and finally get rid of the fear that has plagued him since childhood. His brutal war tactics have made the people of the world think of the Kushan as savages, and that is far from the perception of the real-world Kanishka and Kushan Empire. Miura also turned Ganishka into Shiva himself, but his version looks like Cthulhu with a face that can somehow use the fireball jutsu. Well, we say somehow, but it could be Miura's interpretation of the Pillar of Fire myth, because Ganishka does spit fire, and he is incomprehensibly huge to the human eye. His Shiva is set on destroying the world, so calling it the Destroyer and the End God to equate it with the real-life Shiva is a stroke of genius from a mangaka we sorely miss. R.I.P. Miura-san. Marvelous verdict! Another thing we're going to sorely miss is you, because that's all we've got for this video. The Kushan Empire is one of the most fascinating aspects of Berserk, and while there are many similarities and differences between it and the real one, what truly sets them apart is the unambiguous nature of Miura's Kushans. Their aesthetic is on point, but their intentions have been mostly evil up until this point. With the Eastern Exile chapter in full swing, they have the chance to redeem themselves because it's looking more and more likely that the good guys will use Kushan lands as their home base. We did see a Taj Mahal looking monument towards the end of chapter 375, which further adds to that theory. But with that said, what did you guys think of the video and the real life and fictional Kushan empires? Let us know in the comments down below, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.